Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today, horror, I've got a review for you of a brand new horror novel, Light Most Hateful by Hailey Piper. So this book comes out on the 10th of October from Titan Books, who very kindly sent me a copy to read and review. So I've done the reading part. This is the review part. So let me start by saying I didn't love this book, but I think there are a lot of people out there who will love this book. And that's one of the things that's a bit difficult sometimes about being a reviewer is you can only give your personal opinions of the book. But sometimes you read a book and you think, this book didn't necessarily work 100% for me, but I can really see that there's an audience for it. And I definitely know with this book that there are people out there watching this video today who I think will really, really love this book. So let me talk to you about it and tell you why maybe I didn't love it, but why I think other people would. So the first thing, weirdly, that struck me about this book is that it felt in many ways like a Richard Layman book. So Richard Layman is someone who I've talked about on the channel before. And Richard Layman is in many ways a terrible writer. So that may not sound like a compliment when I say that, but it's meant as a compliment. So Richard Layman, if you don't know him, was an American horror writer, particularly prolific in the 80s and 90s, who wrote a lot of very fast-paced, slightly high-concept horror novels with usually some sort of weird concept at the centre of them, sometimes just a kind of serial killery type concept, but other times weird and wonderful horror type ideas, and he would just come up with an idea and they'd just run with it for the book, and the books tended to be incredibly fast paced, quite kind of graphically violent, but fun, and have a real kind of 80s B-movie vibe to them. Now Layman, rightly gets a lot of criticism for kind of sexism and misogyny and things like that in his work, which definitely is not the case for this Hailey Piper book. He's someone who tends to spend a lot of he spends a lot of time and effort lovingly describing the physical attributes of his female characters. So that's definitely not true of this book. But it does have a lot of that kind of fun 80s vibe to it in terms of just the pace of it and the inventiveness of it, and just the kind of, in a way, kind of slight silliness of it, but in an engaging, fun horror type of way. It's the kind of story that I can imagine having gone to the local video store as a teenager and picking something random off the shelf, not really knowing what it was, and taking it home and watching it, and it being plot-wise like this. So let me tell you what the plot is. So it's set in a small town called Chapel Hill, and it centres on this young woman called Olivia, who's like a bit of a drifter, who's ended up in this town and works at the drive-in, and weird stuff starts happening very quickly. So at the drive-in, within the first couple of chapters of the start of the book, these weird kind of slightly demonic creatures start appearing and devouring people whole, and also others of the residents of the town seem to become kind of slightly zombie-like and mob-like, and just kind of mindlessly wandering around and attacking people. And that part of it reminded me quite a lot of one of Layman's books called One Rainy Night, which I think was one of the first books I read by him. But that idea of people just suddenly becoming a mob. So that's the kind of setup, and the book just runs from there. So it's super fast paced, as I say, right from the start. The action doesn't let up, and it just takes you on a bit of a thrill ride as Olivia and some of her friends try and figure out what's going on and how they can survive. So there's a great deal of kind of weirdness to it. I'm not 100% sure when it's actually set. I'm not sure if it ever says in the book when it's set, but it's definitely got kind of an 80s, 90s feel to it. And I've seen other reviews. So Rachel from the channel Shades of Orange, in her Goodreads review, referred to it. And I'm not sure if this was something I'm not sure if she'd seen another reviewer refer to it like this, or if it was her description of it. But she described it as like a queer Stranger Things, and that feels like an accurate description. Hailey Piper, is a trans author, and that kind of sensitivity to kind of relationships and like friendships and things like that are outside of the traditional heteronormative kind of friendships and relationships definitely comes across in this book. And there's a central kind of relationship between Olivia and a friend of hers who she's trying to find during the chaos that's engulfed this town, that is, I thought, was really interestingly and sensitively written in this book. So that side of it is interesting and quite moving, and definitely as far from Richard Lehman as you could possibly get. So it's a fun read, but as I say, for some reason it just didn't quite click with me, and I think it was like right from the beginning I just didn't feel like I'd fully engaged with the characters and with what was going on. And perhaps it's because it moves at such a pace, and it's quite it's quite light in some ways. So the story is very much kind of action based, and whilst there are these these themes about friendships and relationships which are deeper and more complex, those only come in a lot more in the second half of the book rather than the first half of the book. So personally, I felt maybe a bit more of an even distribution, if you like, of action versus themes throughout the book would have made it hang together a bit better for me personally. But I can definitely see that there's an audience for this kind of book out there. And when I think about the kind of books like Richard Lehman and other books that were huge in that kind of 80s horror boom of just fun horror reads that are gripping and action packed, that's the kind of stuff I loved reading as a teenager and in my 20s. But those books were primarily written by white heterosexual men, yeah, and I, as a white heterosexual man, enjoyed them. So I think it's fantastic that nowadays we are getting far more voices in the horror genre that are not white heterosexual men, and who are writing different kinds of books, but also writing the same kinds of books but from a slightly different perspective, which is what I think this is. So this is a fun. A fun, fast-paced horror read with some inventive, kind of horror and body horror and things like that in it, but also with, written with that queer lens on the world, which is, lacking from the vast majority of the stuff that I read and enjoyed in the 80s. And it's really important, as I say, that we get books like this that are just fun reads, but from a different perspective. The broader the range of voices that we have in the horror in the horror genre, the better, in my opinion. I think horror is one of those communities because horror as a genre speaks to our inner fears and our inner concerns and anxieties and things like that. It's really important that range of the range of people imagining what those fears and anxieties could be is as broad as possible. So I will definitely read more Hailey Piper. This book didn't necessarily work perfectly for me, but it was a fun read, and as I say, I think a lot of people really will enjoy it. So, hope you found that interesting. Do let me know if you've read Hailey Piper and what you think of her work. And as always, thanks very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're reading good stuff, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.